welcome to One Chore Podcast, episode 360. My name is Benjamin Yoder, and I'm here today to be sick. I'm sure you probably can tell from my voice. I am under the weather. I was holding out, hoping my voice would get better by the end of the weekend, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. So I thought about skipping, but I figured I would at least try to do like a shorter episode, maybe. We'll see. I know I can ramble on even when I'm sick, so we'll see how things go. But I think we're just going to really focus on news this week. Some smaller stories I kind of want to cover real quick. There's also towards the end of the show, I think I want to talk a little bit about a Final Fantasy XI survey that was sent out. And then finally, lastly, a really interesting thing. So look, I know I've talked to you guys a ton about NFT stuff over the years as we have tried to figure out kind of what people want out of gamified investment and things like that, right? And questioning like, what is the purpose of all this? I think a lot of this came from Square-Enix's original CEO talking about the fact that he thinks people who are into that stuff are different than normal players. And, you know, I think Bandai Namco and Konami have kind of echoed that a little bit. So, there was a really good in-depth article about Symbiogenesis, the Square-Enix NFT game, about how that game works and what exactly its core appeals are. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that. 4Gamer wrote it. So I think at the end of the show, we'll talk about that as well. So if you don't want to hear about that, it is going to be at the end of the show kind of deal. So yeah, but anyways, just to kind of keep things moving for right now. First and foremost, I just want to talk about a game that I think got announced recently. I don't know the exact timeline on this one, but it's the first time I saw it. It's a game called Ketsu Battler. It's for the Nintendo Switch. It's a really fascinating game because it is, I guess you could call it a fighting game. It is like a 2D one-on-one kind of deal. But how it works is that you're like, I guess you'd call them samurai. But instead of wielding their swords in their hands, they wield the sword between their butt cheeks. And so that's goofy and ridiculous on its own, you know, kind of whatever. I think there's a lot of like indie stuff you could kind of expect to see that kind of thing, right? That's not so out there. I think what makes me kind of really interested in this is that as a Nintendo Switch game, the controls of this game are putting a Joy-Con in the back of your pants. Like basically the whole thing seems to be you kind of like put it, you know, on the actual waist of your pants, and then you tighten your belt, and then that keeps the Joy-Con kind of like right above your kind of like butt crack area, I guess, kind of thing. And so how you're supposed to play the game is by kind of shaking your butt around to determine the angle of which, you know, the butt goes. Now, this is not like, I don't believe it's like a direct one-to-one butt angle kind of thing, right? So I think what's probably happening, I could be wrong, is that you're kind of probably going left and right, and that kind of like determines if you're going left and right on screen kind of thing. But you don't have any controller in your hand or anything. It's just kind of like in your butt. So I thought it looked kind of interesting. You know, I think it's one of those things where I don't think they've really shown a lot about like what is the content of this game very much. I don't even know. Have they said when it's coming out? December 12th. So it's coming out pretty soon. But it seems like a kind of a fun, cute gimmick kind of thing. And yeah, it's one of those things that I sit down and like I worked on that Nintendo video, and I was talking a little bit about the idea that in that Nintendo video I talked about the fact that like the Switch's identity isn't necessarily the thing that I think is appealing to me, right? Like I think that I have a hard time understanding what the Switch's identity is as a platform. But that doesn't change that there's like interesting, unique stuff on the system, right? I think Buddy Mission Bond's a great game. I really love the idea of Nintendo Labo, even though I haven't really, you know, executed on that much. Kaminazo and stuff like that as well. You know, Kaminazo doesn't necessarily need to be on the Switch, but I think it is a game that I feel like is a very Switch-oriented game in the sense of like there's a little bit of that kind of like exploratory shove the Joy-Con in your pants element to the Nintendo Switch, but I just don't think it's the main focus, right? But I think that's like something that I've largely kind of, unfortunately, I don't want to say ignored, but I've kind of let pass me by on the Switch a little bit, I feel like. Not that there's like a ton of it. I just feel like I haven't really engaged with it in a way that I think I wish I did a little bit more, especially as we come closer to the end of the system's lifespan a little bit. Why that's the case, I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think sometimes it's just hard to tell until like things are kind of wrapping up, right? To be like, okay, well, here are the things that like really jumped out at me and like things I really want to look at. I really wish Game Builder Garage, I think, is something that I did recently pick up Game Builder Garage, but like something like that was something more in line with like stuff I wanted to kind of look at. There's that one like toilet paper roll game where you put the Joy-Con in a toilet paper roll and like move it around on the cardboard and things like that. Something like that. And like I don't necessarily think there's a ton of that on the system. I could be wrong. The slapping game, I didn't play that either. Like I think there's just like there's some key titles that I feel like I really would benefit from playing on the Switch at some point and using the Joy-Con. Whether or not that would get me like, what I'd want out of the Switch is a whole other thing. But, it is something that like I feel like as much as I complain about stuff like Another Code and Endless Ocean coming back on the Switch and being like, I don't really want this because it's kind of just more of that. Some of these games, I should probably give them more of a direct chance. I think Labo in specific is something that, I haven't really given the strongest opportunity to succeed. I probably need to go ahead and pick that stuff up before it gets too expensive, because I think that is probably at the end of the day, when I think about the Nintendo Switch and like what I want out of that system, and as we kind of look back on the system, I think the Labo is really the place that's left on the Switch that I would probably get the most value out of at this point. So, yeah, I don't know, but I think it's really cool. Ketsu Battle seems like a neat idea. I don't know if like obviously the game itself, who knows about like what depth there is there, right? Might be one of those things where, there's some games on the Wii where it's just like you just kind of waggle around a little bit and, give it like 30 minutes and it's a good time, right? And then it's done. And then like you're like, yeah, cool. Like, I think that kind of experience is not a bad thing per se. I think, obviously it just kind of comes down to like, what is the cost and what kind of value put in there. And also I think what is the potential of an idea, right? There are some games that I feel like the potential is not executed on. And so it kind of leaves you wanting, but shoving the Joy-Con in your butt pocket and waggling around in a way that, you waggle against somebody else who has a Joy-Con in their butt, pocket, pants, not butt pocket. I wonder if could you put it in your butt pocket? I don't know, but in the back of your pants kind of thing. I think that's a valid experience on its own, right? But obviously, if it's like a $30 video game, it's a little harder to justify. Thankfully, that's where like digital comes into play, where you can usually charge a lot cheaper for that kind of stuff. So this game does not look like super well produced. I will say, it looks like there's some character design for sure. Like they actually did do character design, and I think they did a good job on the character models for what it is. But the environments are largely, in the videos I've seen, just a bunch of butt references. And then like just like a giant, space with just like one texture on it kind of thing. So it's pretty interesting. Recently I was reading an interview with the Yakuza guy. I forget, was it with Automata Media? Is that who was interviewing him? Or did they just translate the interview? Let me see. Did they say... he's talking to Famitsu, but Automata Media is the one who translated this. But his name is Toshihiro Nagoshi. I think he also did Super Monkey Ball series in the past as well. I think he's online, at least, kind of the meme guy, because he used to like look like kind of a nerd, and then he became like this very like tanned fellow, very cleaned up kind of thing. And one thing in his so he left Sega a while ago. I think he's getting funded by NetEase or something like that. And they're making a new game, and it sounds like they're trying to create something that probably like hits the vibe of Yakuza, but obviously probably not directly. 80 people working on it, looks like, according to this page, as well as it can be considered a high-end game with a focus on human drama. However, one thing that really stood out to me in this is his reluctance to create a large game. Talking about the fact that like large-scale map design and large-scale content just feels unnecessary anymore, given the shifting priorities of people who play games, people who want more of a quality experience, I guess. I'm kind of paraphrasing, so go read the actual article if you want. That's like 1-to-1, but it seems like there's a lot more. He's basically saying is that he just wants to create kind of like a compact experience that kind of does what he wants without having to worry about how many hours of playtime am I going to get you. And he kind of talks about the fact that there's like so many games out there and you just can't play them all. So trying to like create an excess, isn't necessarily needed. I think this probably depends. And I don't know if maybe this has changed a lot, because I think part of the value discussion probably in the past comes from a couple different things. One, video games are inherently expensive when we talk about like pay to play kind of games, right? Not free to play. And you know, it's pricey, you know, $50-$60, not a cheap price for a video game, right? I'm happy to spend that on Battle Wonderworld, but a lot of other people aren't, and they want to make sure that they're getting their money's worth, right? So I think that has, I don't know if that's dissipated or it just feels like it dissipated. It's one of those things that's like hard for me to tell sometimes because I'm an adult now, right? So if you're a 15-year-old, has the free-to-play market shifted that in a way where it's like, I don't need whatever next game I play to fill my 200 hours of time, right? I can buy a game or get a game for Christmas and enjoy it for 20 hours. And then from there, go play Fortnite again, right? I'm curious like what that dynamic looks like today. Obviously, it's not like, I think probably when you think about Yakuza games and things like that, you're probably thinking of an older audience. And so maybe an older audience, you have restricted time as is and things like that. But I think this is not anything particularly new, but I think it was just interesting to see this like kind of addressed more directly from a game designer who's like making a video game. And that doesn't necessarily mean he's right? I just I think it's interesting that that's how he kind of positions it. Especially with like how a lot of video games, when it comes to like free to play and live service games, things like that, the focus is on creating enough content to keep you busy like almost year round, or at least frequently releasing content enough that you keep coming back to the game, right? So I hope whatever he does next is really cool. I hope it doesn't just like look like a weird offshoot of Yakuza. I don't expect it to look like that, but you know, I think he's got a new fresh slate to work with, and I hope whatever he makes, you know, I'm sure it would be good if it follows the values of what he's created in the past, but I wouldn't want it to be like some kind of like, oh, you know how Yakuza is vanilla flavored? This is the strawberry flavored Yakuza. I feel like Judgment kind of was that, and that's kind of why I didn't care about Judgment at all. Cause just like, yeah, I mean, I like that it's got like a different theme to it, but overall, I don't actually care about Judgment. I at least know more than I care about other Yakuza games kind of thing. So a little bit of a follow-up here on a news story. I think we've talked about this a couple times now. This has been kind of an ongoing issue, and Automata Media has reported on this a handful of times. I feel like more and more Automata Media is just like the main news source for us these days. I've become an Automata Media news regurgitation machine. So if you don't remember, DL Site, which is kind of like an indie doujin website that sells, you know, magazines, books, games, things like that, and some of that's 18 plus, some of it's not. They earlier this year had some issues when it came to payment processing because, you know, what is acceptable in that particular, you know, area in terms of sexual content, in terms of what is the difference in Japanese acceptability versus, you know, worldwide acceptability, all that kind of stuff came up in a way where basically payment processors like Visa and MasterCard and things like that no longer allow purchase to be made with their card through those websites. And so it's been, I don't know, I don't really know a lot about the Japanese market in terms of like how much cards are coming to play. When you go visit Japan, typically it's pushed as like, hey, it's a cash society. But when we're talking about, you know, a website like DL Site, how are you getting that money kind of thing, right? And so there's been a lot of things trying to get around that kind of like restrictions that are being put in place kind of thing. I believe there's a couple other sites that this ran into an issue too, like some art websites and things like that too, where people go and draw art and stuff like that. Again, with 18 plus content, that's kind of where the issue comes into play. A doujin retailer called Melon Books in Japan. I don't know if you guys have, I don't know if we've talked about Melon Books on the show much, but they are a doujin retailer in Japan. They have another like side group. What are they called? I'm trying to remember. I think they mentioned the Automata Media article here. It's Melon Books, and they have a different branch, I think, for content for women. I think Melon Books is aimed at men, and then the other one is aimed at women. What is it? I can't remember. I think it starts like an F or something. Anyways, that being said, they have two branches basically, as far as I know, or two types of storefronts. But they essentially also have ran into the issue. They're going to be suspending Visa and MasterCard payments and that kind of stuff. I think December 19th is what it's listed as the last time you can transact through there. Again, due to sexual content, Dojin space, there is sexual content in Dojin space. Dojin does not mean sexual content, just to reiterate that, but it is a part of that space for sure. But they're doing a really interesting promotion to try to get around this a little bit, or maybe I wouldn't say get around this, make the best of, or maybe not even make the best of a bad situation. Try to reduce the damage here, which is basically they are still able to do transactions through American Express, which I'm surprised, but also JCB, which JCB, as far as I can tell, is a Japanese bank or something along those lines. The card itself, at least, is a Japanese-based one. And so, but what they're doing is basically you get like a 30% discount on purchases until November, or till the end of November, sorry. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about it in that way, in terms of just like trying to essentially get people to, I don't know if it's like to get people to move bank accounts or just to get people to use their JCB cards, the JCB ones or not, or create bank accounts. I don't really know like what the Japanese banking system's like. If there's a cost to opening a JCB setup. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that there's almost like a push to get you to change banks for a different card, or at least that's what like my interpretation of what this thing is. They apparently have not said exactly what this 30% off thing is for. But you know, I think people are just making assumptions that is what it's for. I think it's really interesting that is kind of, maybe it's like smart in terms of like trying to salvage that business. I don't really know like how DL Site has been impacted financially from these changes. I don't know how much Japanese people are using Visa or MasterCard or things like that. But I think it's really interesting. They also, I don't know if this is part of the discount, but they do accept convenience store pay kind of stuff. I think Japan has a lot of different like payment options that I think are different than what the US typically kind of runs into with that stuff. You know, I think we're a very like credit card, debit card based society here in the US, and in Japan, I think it hasn't been as kind of like one lane for a while. I guess in the US, we also have like phone pay stuff now, which I think Japan, it sounds like is kind of the phone pay stuff is like what's becoming more popular there. But I know like a bunch of like there's PayPay, and like I think convenience stores have payment processing things too, and I think you can buy things with like your train card and things like that. So I think there's been like a lot of options, and then maybe not anything that's like really been standardized. But I'm not living in Japan, so I don't know. I'm not sitting here trying to tell you what it's like, but I just think it's an interesting promotion to try to get people to get around this particular issue that's going on, because yeah, I think it is one of those interesting situations where, you know, you have so many things that are standardized in the world being like a globalized service kind of thing, and then when it gets down to local politics of it, it gets muddy, and then there's like oh well, that's not really acceptable, and from a either US mindset or a more global mindset, right? And then that creates its own problem. So I just thought it was an interesting way to approach that kind of thing. So I know DL Site try to do their own, like, hey, you can buy points from this other company that's definitely not us. and then you could use those points on our website. As far as I'm aware, that whole thing got shut down at some point. I think it was too obvious. DL Site seemed very upfront about like what they were doing to try to get around things, where Melon Books sounds like they're just apologizing and just doing different things. So anyways, that's that. Before we get into the last couple stories here, I just want to go over some Ko-fi stuff. One, again, thank you Demodori and Conspicuous Snoop for donating. I mentioned last podcast that I was going to try to take a day off to do work on stuff, it didn't work out, unfortunately. I had family in town, and so my schedule got a little cramped in terms of work. And then I got sick, and just like also there's this event that came up at work, so just a lot of things kind of crammed together. What I may do to kind of try to make sure this moves forward and doesn't just keep getting put off, I may, instead of taking a full day off work, just take like half a day or maybe take 3 hours off. And then go work on something because I think in my mind, what I'm learning through this year is that like 2 to 3 hours is like a really good time frame for me to do something. Outside of that, I start to really get bogged down and stuff. So if I work on like a video for 2 or 3 hours, that's a really solid amount of time. The problem is when I spend an entire day working on a video and I just like basically become a trash man throughout that day. So that's still the plan for that. But upcoming content and stuff. Well, actually, what came out last week was Japan Retro Direct pickups. I went ahead and put that up. Basically, just me kind of going through some of the games I picked up. I really need to solve my problem with like the light getting blown out. I feel like there's like no good range between overly exposed and underexposed. I only have like a Logitech webcam, right? So I'm not exactly working with the greatest setup with that kind of thing. Basically, just leftover parts from my stream and podcast setup is what's happening there. Also, within that vein, next week, is it next week? Is it next week? Yeah, next week. Japan Retro Direct's runner, the person who runs it, Vink from Famicom Dojo, he's going to be on the Hot Pot Gaming. And we talk about, the initial start of it is to talk about like why he likes games for kids and like what he thinks is valuable in that and the different perspectives. But really, I think the conversation about halfway through the show shifts over to this idea that like, being able to kind of like appreciate and resonate with games that your kids are into can be like a really good family building exercise, I think. And it's nice to hear about that kind of stuff. So, it's a really, I really liked how it turned out. So I hope you guys listen to that next week. I hope you enjoy it. So that will be up next week, for that. And then the week after that, there might be a podcast between, I think before the next thing, but I have a podcast highlight for the 64 Trump card collection. This is that Alice in Wonderland card game. I put together a podcast highlight for that, so that's going to go up. I'm trying to get those out because there are some games that I talked about this year that I am really excited to share on YouTube to a larger audience. So I would like to get those done. Things like the that one DSi War gambling game I played kind of thing. So that being said, we are getting towards the end of the year here, so I think we are going to look at the end of the year doing a end of the year podcast. I think how it lines up is the 30th. I think is when it'll work out. So I'll probably have something planned for the 30th of December to go up. I don't remember. Don't quote me on that. I think that's how the dates line up for this. So. But what I might do for that Hot Pot Gaming episode is push it out till next year. So instead of coming up at the end of the month, because I think if I put out the Hot Pot Gaming episode at the same time it normally comes out, it would come out like during Christmas week or something. And so I don't know, everyone's busy and I don't really necessarily want to put it out like on Christmas Day or whatever it is. So I think I'm going to push that out until the first week of the new year. So I think that'll be like on January 6th. So there might be like an extra little bit of a gap between the Vink Hot Pot Gaming and the upcoming ones. So that one's a really interesting one, by the way. The one that's coming up in the beginning of next year. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to actually present it, but it was a conversation I didn't really expect to have with somebody, and it was somebody who reached out to me, which was really unique in this situation. So I will say, if you want to talk about anything, just feel free to let me know. I can't guarantee I'll bring you on. I have to like make sure I feel good about whatever we're going to talk to you about, or I have to have an idea. I don't want to just talk to you just to be like, hey, we're here to talk, and then have like nothing to talk about, right? Or nothing that I'd be interested in like asking questions. Like the big thing is I need to be able to ask you questions about stuff. So part of it is on my side. But if you do interesting stuff and you like feel like you have, I mean, part of what I've kind of shifted towards is like the idea of like highlighting undervalued perspectives and things like that. That's not a hard, fast rule. But, I think that kind of stuff where it's like, hey, here's a topic that I think either doesn't get talked about in the way that I think it should be talked about or feels undercovered. Feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to at least consider you at the very least. I just can't guarantee if you come to me and be like, oh man, Ben, I really want to talk about No More Heroes. I'll be like, I mean, maybe there's a world where you present me a compelling argument for No More Heroes as a podcast topic, but I think it would require a lot of explaining. So, but yeah, either way, don't be afraid to. All right, we're wrapping into our last two topics here. Again, thank you, Demandor and Conspicuous Snoop, for donating. I appreciate it. Hopefully I'll get something up on the Ko-fi for you guys soon enough for when you want to check it out. The last two stories here, I think they're things that people might be less interested in, so I wanted to kind of shove them in on the end here. We've talked about Final Fantasy XI a lot this year. This is not about my Final Fantasy XI experience right now. This is related to the retail Final Fantasy XI server, so the one that Square-Enix is currently running. Again, I'm playing on an unofficial side server kind of thing that is more like rollback. So the things I talk about with Final Fantasy XI recently do not necessarily apply to what I'm talking about right now. But Square-Enix put out a survey for, I forget if it was for current players or people who haven't played as well. I feel like it was more geared towards people who haven't played or haven't been playing or something. I could be wrong. But the survey seemed to be kind of like gauging an interest of like what exactly would get you to come back to Final Fantasy XI. They've been doing stuff over time. I don't know what they're putting out. I think most of what I see is like battleground related stuff where they're doing like fights and things like that. And I don't necessarily know how that content's being created. If it's just like shuffling around elements that already exist or what. But they are still updating Final Fantasy XI. And but the survey basically asks two big things, or at least from the path I went down. I think there's different paths you can go down and there's different questions, but I could be wrong. I think that's what I saw. Because I think I said I didn't play, and I think they skipped me ahead to like very late in the survey to talk about things about not playing kind of thing. But they basically asked like, when did you stop playing? And they kind of categorized it based off expansions mostly. There are some exceptions when it comes to things called add-ons, which are not really full expansions, but were kind of like filler in between a specific era of expansions when Final Fantasy XI was kind of getting winded down a little bit, but then kind of ended up in this weird in-between period because of Final Fantasy XIV not succeeding. So they did ask about that. But then they also ask you, like, what would convince you to come back to play Final Fantasy XI? And I don't, one thing is to be clear about when these surveys happen, that does not necessarily mean that things are going to happen, right? I think a lot of surveys happen where a lot of questions get asked. Every year, there's like or not every year, but there's a long history of like Nintendo surveys, things like that, where they're like, hey, what do you think about a new wave race? It's like, no. I mean, yes, I want a new wave race, but no, it's not going to happen unless like a billion people fill out wave race. But there's not, or internet people, like who actually cares? Internet people are crazy. Basically they asked for things like, hey, would it be additional scenarios and quests that would get you to come back? Would it be a lower monthly fee? I think it's like $13 still. I think originally it was $9. I think they raised it to $13 at some point. I think it's been at that point since. I could be wrong. I think that is right though. Adjustments to existing content. This kind of thing is a little weird. They did a little bit of this recently where there's this whole kind of like server-wide scale content called Besieged, where basically over time, these military groups of beastmen, basically, which are kind of the evil group of that game, but part of the story is like, how bad are the beastmen really? But it's an MMO, so day one you'd be able to walk out and kill an orc, and then day 3000 you also need to be able to walk out of town and kill an orc. So we're not going to solve that problem in this video game, sorry. But the beastmen basically build up forces and then they attack one of the towns in the game. And recently they made some adjustments to that to make it more of a challenging content, although I don't really know how that was received. But it was interesting. That's like an old 2005, 2006 content that they kind of revived recently. They also asked about job balances, additional battle content. One that was actually jumped out at me, support for game consoles. And why this jumps out is because if you've been reading the interviews about Final Fantasy XI's future, it's been pretty bleak in the sense that like basically their excuse for any time anything comes about doing anything with Final Fantasy XI on any platform other than PC is that it will cost too much money. And it's very funny, and like when you put it alongside the Nobunaga's Ambition MMO, which also started on PS2, and that thing can be played on a PS5. So, and it's funny because I think in that interview, I think we talked about it on here, like they were like, hey, why didn't you bring Final Fantasy 11 on future consoles? And basically the answer was Final Fantasy 14 was meant to replace Final Fantasy 11, which is a really interesting thing when you think about the numbering of Final Fantasy. But also, they were like, it'd be too expensive. And like, meanwhile, Nobunaga Ambition MMO people are over there, like, we're like, we're going to get this, like, this is going to run on everything, every PlayStation in the future. So really interesting that they're kicking around, or at least asking for the question of like what support we'd like on game consoles. I'd be really curious if Final Fantasy 11 ended up on any game console going forward, but I don't know. I don't know what that process would look like in terms of like how much that would cost. That's kind of the big thing they talk about a lot with doing anything with Final Fantasy 11 in terms of the game client and updating that or anything like that, is that they're just like the cost of doing that would be the cost of like a full of the video game. However, I would be curious because, Final Fantasy 14 definitely has driven a lot of interest in Final Fantasy 11 over time. If that equation has changed, and not just from like a Final Fantasy 14 making Final Fantasy 11 more interesting kind of perspective, so bringing it to new people, but also in the sense that like I think Square-Enix is trying to do more surefire bets, and if they do Final Fantasy 11 over, some random live service game they're trying to put together, there's probably a little bit more guarantee there'll be interest there. I don't think it would be a huge hit, to be absolutely clear. I'm not saying that Final Fantasy 11 would get like a ton of new traffic on a console, but it might be one of those things where like they could possibly justify the cost and then get some of that bleed off kind of thing. That being said, 2 MMOs, it's really tough to play those at the same time. Also, I don't necessarily know what Final Fantasy 11, I don't know. It's one of those things that like I probably need to sit down and like talk to somebody who's played Final Fantasy 11 after playing Final Fantasy 14 to really understand what the appeal is. My assumption is a lot of it has to do with lore and aesthetic. I could be wrong, but that is my assumption. But I think I say that being very ignorant of modern Final Fantasy 14 or 11 still. That is still, it's a whole other thing. At some point, this whole Final Fantasy 11 experience I'm doing on Horizon does not address that equation, just to be clear. Now, I want to be very upfront in saying that, like, I think modern Final Fantasy 11 has its appeal. I think modern Final Fantasy 11 has its own value set that I think ultimately people will enjoy more. I think it is not a thing where, it's like, oh, Final Fantasy 11 used to be so great in this regard, but modern Final Fantasy 11 is not like good or something like that. I just think the way that Final Fantasy 11 is good today probably is different than old Final Fantasy 11. And you have to ask at that point, it's the bigger question at that point is like, what is the larger appeal? I think old level 75 Final Fantasy 11 has a very narrow appeal with a very narrow audience. That being said, I have met multiple people on the Horizon 11 who have never played Final Fantasy 11 before, and they want to play the old broken one. That being said, I think in at least one case, somebody said they came from EverQuest, or had played EverQuest 1, which Final Fantasy 11 is very heavily based off EverQuest. The other person I'm thinking of right now, they had never played an old Final Fantasy MMO. So, like, I was talking to them, trying to figure out, like, what got you to play this game, and it seems to come down to, like, the flexibility with jobs, I think a level of challenge. And they also said story, and I don't know, I'm a little curious about that because I didn't really dig too deep into that. But I think maybe one of the challenges, maybe not challenges, one of the differences between Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14 is Final Fantasy 14, I think one thing that gets explained as is like it is like an amusement park for Final Fantasy, and it like more directly pulls from other Final Fantasy games in a lot of different ways. Some of that I think is, I could be wrong. I haven't played Final Fantasy 14 in so long, so please understand if you're like, Ben, that's wrong. It's not me trying to be malicious in this regard, and I'm just trying to. I will figure out at some point, hopefully. But I think Final Fantasy 14 maybe pulls a little bit more directly from other Final Fantasies. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's the case. Or Final Fantasy 11, I think, is kind of like wholly on its own. And in some ways, Final Fantasy 14 has the unfortunate thing of, in trying to replace Final Fantasy 11, I think resulting in it having a lot of baggage from Final Fantasy 11 in terms of just aesthetic, race design, character design. A lot of things I think kind of come forward from that in a way that I in hindsight, I wish didn't happen, honestly. I love Final Fantasy 14 1.0. It was great, and like there's a lot of things about it that I adore. But I think there's a lot of things about Final Fantasy 14 I kind of wish 1.0 didn't happen. But I don't say that in the same way other people do. I say that in the way that, like, I think Final Fantasy 14 2.0 would have been better as its own video game. For me, at least. Like, if it had its own standalone world, it was like its own aesthetic look, own appeal. And if it wasn't so connected to an experience that I had a lot with, like, I talked about this fairly recently, like I think part of my frustration with Final Fantasy 14 comes from my memory of Final Fantasy 14 1.0 and like what I liked about that game and that stuff not being there anymore. So it's like always apparent that stuff's not there. And then when I play Final Fantasy 14 again, hopefully next year, hopefully that is something that I don't get caught up on. Because I saw someone recently about it, I was like, what a sad thing it would be to be like, the reason I hate this video game is because I liked the old version of it better and no other reason. Like, I don't think that's a reasonable way to dislike a game. Reasonable reason to dislike a game. That doesn't mean that I'd have to like Mono 14 again. Just to be clear, I just think I have like I just don't. Yeah. Anyways, we talk about this. We've talked about this a lot. Sorry, I went on a whole tangent there. New character development elements. I don't know what that means. Oh, there's like characters, storytelling, or if they mean like building a character. Like, hey, here's a new set of gear, or like a new way to level up your character, which I think they've kind of continued to do already. So collaborations, I think that's kind of a boring way. If they did that, I think that'd be a really boring thing to do. Changes in my lifestyle. Oh, this is what would convince you to return is what it was. So changes in my lifestyle is one of them. I don't know, Square Enix. If you could like, I don't know, could you give me like a career path, Square Enix? That would make me happy. That would make me more like play Final Fantasy 11. That's obviously not something they're going to do. And then I don't think I'll return this thing. I think the biggest thing on there was the support for game consoles. I think that's the thing that jumped out to me most. Lower monthly fee, I think people that would get some attention. I just don't know if it would like draw people in kind of thing. So anyways, I don't know. I would love to see where things go with Final Fantasy 11. Like they seem to just keep trying to get it pulled together as time goes on. So, all right. And lastly, so you don't have to listen to my raspy voice anymore. We're going to be talking about Symbiogenesis. This is the Square Enix NFT game. We talked about this recently because I nosed my nose into what it was doing because it was announced a long time ago, and then I had found out that they were on like chapter 2. I was like, oh, I didn't know the actual game like straight up came out. And I started to nose into like, well, okay, what are they selling? Because NFTs, obviously you're selling characters typically, and that's the case here as well. What are they selling? And what is the gameplay like? And then when I looked into this, and we talked about this before, a lot of the game seems built on a Discord backend where a lot of discussion happens in Discord. I was saying all this from just like trying to read as much as I can from the outside. I did not play the game. I have no particular interest in playing the game either personally, because I think that would require a lot of engagement. But somebody over at 4Gamer did play the game. And they played it so they're at the end of chapter 2 right now. Chapter 2 is basically done, and then chapter 3 is about to launch. So it's kind of a lull for the game, it sounds like, but they did sit down and start playing it and start interacting with the community. And the way they described the game is they called it kind of Where's Waldo-esque. Basically, the reason why is because a core part of this game is, we've talked about it before, but there's a website, and this website has a giant map. And you can go around and look at different characters on the website and things like that. And it sounds like what you're doing on this map is you get hints basically, and you need to find secret items and things like that on the map. So you need to go and basically like tap somewhere to try to find the item. And you have like a stamina amount, and anytime you try to check somewhere on the map, that drains a certain level of stamina kind of thing. So you're basically using hints in the game to go look for these items on the map. And then as you progress, it's kind of like a visual novel kind of thing. So that sounds very simple, right? It's pretty much go click on a website and then, unlock a cutscene or something. And then you get, a visual novel that plays out. And it sounds like the main character is the only character in this world that's not an NFT character that you can buy kind of thing. But the key thing in this game is the community interaction. This is kind of probably why the whole Discord element kind of comes into play as a big deal, is that the point of the game seems to be is that the community as a whole is meant to kind of solve the story for each chapter. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 are done. So these larger stories that people kind of interact with. And so once that story is complete, then everybody can read chapter 1 and chapter 2 at that point. But, people have to go in the Discord channel and talk to each other. And then also they have to buy characters. And what buying characters does is basically provide, I think we've talked a little bit about this before, there's different levels of characters, where one is like a quest hint style character, which basically gives you hints for quests when you buy them. Some characters seem to be a little bit more just like general lore kind of characters, like if you want to learn about like the Alchemist Guild or something. I'm making that up entirely, but that kind of thing. Then you buy this type of character. And then there's 2 more types of characters, which are unique story characters. And there's 2 different categories for them. I don't really know what the difference is. I think one might be more like secondary story characters and one's like actual main story characters. And we talked about the price before, but it's around $50 to about $500 for each character. I think in the initial purchase price, when somebody buys a character, they can then sell that later, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But so yeah, kind of the point of the game is to go and buy these characters. And I think this is part of where I saw on stream, where there's like almost an auction format to their streams where they go around the world and they talk about these different characters and then people can buy them kind of thing. And I'm not quite sure what they were saying on stream to kind of entice people to buy them. I don't know if it's like, oh, well, this kind of character will give you this information or something like that, or if it's just like more general backstory about it. But it seems to be that's kind of the goal, is to kind of buy up these characters and then basically use them for information to progress the story forward. There's some interesting stuff where it's like, while there is like direct discussion in Discord, it seems like you can also individually do things to try to learn about characters through renting characters, basically. So if somebody buys a character, they can lend them out to you for basically like 100 yen, and you can get their information and things like that to try to solve stuff. So all this stuff, I think we probably can all agree on. This sounds kind of silly when it comes from a purchasing perspective, $50 to $500 for a character to get like a piece of lore or a piece of story. For people like us, I imagine nobody listening to this podcast actually cares about that, right? This is where things got a little interesting, though. So obviously when it comes to NFTs, part of the idea of NFTs is that they'll increase in value, right? And exactly how that works is a whole other thing. You can call it a scam or whatever. For some reason, these things are supposed to increase in value. How that works out, I'm not here to tell you how that works or doesn't work. I'm sure there's like a bunch of videos out there to tell you about it either way, right? And I'm not interested in exploring that functionality. I'm only interested here in like what people want out of this kind of thing. But this is maybe the first time I've seen somebody do something about like actually driving value in terms of driving the value of an NFT up in price kind of thing. And it seems to largely be based around characters that have information that is critical to progression. And so basically what can happen is you buy a character and they could have a very critical piece of information for progressing the story. And essentially what you can do with that, instead of renting them out, is you basically can say, hey, I have this character and they have good information and I'm going to convey that to the rest of the community and then say, if you want to buy this information from me or buy this character from me to get that information, I'm going to raise the price based off the information they have kind of thing, right? And the reason why this kind of comes into play later on is because at the end of this game, so apparently they have said this is going to be like a 2-year run. I was not aware of this, but this is what the article says. And I want to be clear, all this is machine translated, so there might be some iffiness in all of this. But there's going to be a 2-year run for the game, 6 chapters, or at least that is what they're promising right now. So they're going to chapter 3, so they're about halfway through. And the thing that we've talked about before is that at the end of this whole experience, 3 players as a whole will have the information needed to challenge the final mission. And they'll be the ones who ultimately, I assume, save the world or something. I don't really know the narrative of this game. And so like that, I think kind of rolls into, from what I'm reading from this article, that kind of rolls into like the value of information. Like if you want to have an advantage in making sure that you are going to be in one of those slots at the end for chapter 3, then you can kind of like use this information as a way, like keep the information secret so it is for you specifically, or, you know, again, drive up the value of a character so you can sell it to somebody else, kind of thing. So kind of the takeaways that the 4Gamer person, I actually get their name. Like I think sometimes I like go in this phase where like, because like it's a Japanese article, I don't necessarily say their names, and I really should probably say their names. Although scrolling through this article, I'm not seeing a person's name attached to this. I see the editorial department attached to it, which is their Asakusa branch. Is that what that is? Is this a writer or is this just a location? Well, it says Akasaka. I don't know if that's the person or something. I don't see a name on this article though, but well, that's our first attempt. Something I just need to keep in mind for the future. I really should include these names for these people and stuff. I was thinking about it last week with the whole like cosplay person. I was glad I mentioned their name. It's like I really should credit people as much as possible in this regard. But they're kind of big takeaways where they felt like this is a game that didn't feel like a traditional play to earn kind of game. I never really understood the term play to earn. I think in some ways this sounds like play to earn because of this whole like, you know, driving up value based on the quality of information and the secrecy of information. So to me that reads as play to earn, but they seem to, again, through the machine translation, say it doesn't feel like a typical play to earn game. They also say it doesn't feel like a typical Square-Enix style RPG. The thing they compared it to was almost like a multiplayer escape game over a large course of time where you're solving a puzzle with like a whole community. And they said the key appeal in their eyes was using your information as a bargaining chip. So the information that you know as the player, you have control of that. And then so that means you can do things in terms of, you know, changing the price value of characters and things like that. Now, one thing that they did say is that they didn't really get to personally experience this because chapter 2 is over and chapter 3 is not launched. So they're like, they haven't experienced this, but it sounds like it's what they're getting from the other players communicated to them about what the appeal is, or maybe to some extent, maybe the people, I don't know who actually works on this. I know Square-Enix is the publisher. I don't know who the developer is. If it is an internal Square team or if it is a separate developer. I don't think it's a double jump joint. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's the case. I probably should look into it at some point. But so that was kind of their view of like what the value of this game was. And they said that they plan to try to experience that in chapter 3. But like hearing that using your own information as a bargaining chip, I think like on paper I can see it. You know, obviously this kind of gets into the thing I was talking about before with gamified investments, where it is a manipulation of money, like you're giving us $50 to $500 based off, you know, unknown information. It probably is a very whale-like experience, right? That being said, that is true for a lot of mobile games, but I think maybe the thing that is a little weird about it is that it's like pits other players against each other, right? And in the case of a mobile game, you know, it is solely who that person or the company that you're kind of engaging with in terms of giving money. But in the case of this, you're reselling information to other players for real money. So it's interesting. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if that is a problem or not. If anything, you might think, well, it's at least it's going to another player and not just going straight to the company and that's it. I don't know if they take a transaction fee on top of it, but I don't really know. I don't really know the ethics of that and like what that feels like. But obviously, you know, we're talking about a game mode where, you know, you potentially could inflate the price of a character by hundreds or thousands of dollars. I don't know for sure. I'm just giving that as an example. To essentially kind of lock the lore behind this giant price tag, right? And I think for everyday people like us who, man, I don't know what you're doing with your money. For people like me who spend $20 on a mobile game or something like that at most, right? That's just so outside of the scope of what I'm willing to spend for something. So, but I think this is like maybe the most like clear information I've gotten about like what one of these games are doing and like how that NFTs as a whole is a semi-unique thing here, where you are able to kind of change the value price. Now, from a playability perspective, we talk about the game experience of playing a game. Does the real money part actually matter? In my opinion, probably not. But I think it is. I think that is a mechanic that comes about because of the incentives of NFTs to have their values increased, right? And it's like some of the things I said before with like Senran Kagura Peach Peach Splash, where it's like Senran Kagura Peach Peach Splash as a third-person shooter may not necessarily be super unique, but I think the setting of Senran Kagura applied to a third-person shooter creates this very specific thing that I think doesn't exist without Senran Kagura as the basis, right? So I think sometimes those, like, the inspiration for those things can come out of some core things. And I think in this case, this definitely sounds more like a traditional, like, this sounds like there's a value to having NFTs engage with this. What you think that value is and what I think that value is kind of, I think, separate. What I'm doing with this is trying to understand why people are engaged in gamified investment, right? That's kind of what I'm doing here. So anyways, I thought it was interesting. Well, we did a normal episode. Hopefully my voice wasn't too grating to hear. I think we talked about some interesting stuff in this episode, so hopefully it's not too unlistenable, but hopefully I'll feel better. And then, when I have the podcast for Vink go up, that my voice is normal there, so you'll get that. So I think everything will probably be fine. I did have one time in college where my voice, after getting sick, was screwed for like almost 2.5 weeks. So who knows? Maybe next time I'll be still shaking it off, but we'll see. So, anyways, thank you so much for listening. Thanks so much for coming. OneShoulder.com is the website. Again, check out that Vink podcast next week. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Also, if you didn't see it, go check out that Japan Retro Direct unboxing video where I go through some stuff I imported from Japan Retro Direct recently. So, anyways, thank you again. Hope you guys have a great 2 weeks. Bye.